Okay, so in this chapter we're going to go over modeling using curves. So as a starting point, we're going to start with this piece of geometry we created in the last chapter, and we're going to go into our EP curve tool. And going into the front view here, I'm going to draw a profile using the EP curve tool. You'll notice that I am using the grid for precision, snapping the control vertices of the EP curve to the grid. And just kind of trying to come up with an interesting shape. If I want to change this later, I can do so, but that looks pretty good for now. And what we're going to do with this curve is use it to show off some of the ways we can use curves to model in Maya, which I find is a very precise way to do modeling. And so right now I'm just going to kind of get this out of the way, go up to my Edit menu and duplicate it, and we'll snap it again 4 more units to the right. There we go. We're going to use these two curves to create a piece of geometry. And so we do that by changing from the Polygon tab to Surfaces, and then go in Surface Loft. And now we have a nice, neat, lofted object. And the reason this object came out very clean is the settings that I'm using. So I want to go over those real quick. So go up to Surfaces Loft and open up the Options tab. And for game modeling, you want to make sure that you're set to polygons. And the tessellation method is general. You want to be in quads. You could be in triangles, but I prefer to be in quads. And you want to make sure that the per span number of isoparams is set to 1. And I'll show you why I think it's important to set the tessellation controls to 1. So let's reel off this with them at 3. Apply that, and you can see now that it's given us tessellation that's not necessary for a game model. You got to remember that because this is for games, we have to model efficiently. And so let's put this back to 1. Now you can see that we have just the necessary edges and verts needed to pretty much get us the same exact shape. But since we're modeling with curves, you don't have to worry about getting your settings totally right, because we can always go into the channel box after the fact and fix them. So you can see I went back in and changed them to 3 and now 16. And that's the cool thing about working with curves, is we have flexibility to, after we do a loft or an extrusion or revolve something, we can always go to the channel box and kind of fine-tune our result. So I'm going to get rid of one of the profile curves here, and let's bring this other one back to the origin. And now we're going to go over revolving. And so what I'm going to do right now is go to Surfaces Revolve and go over the revolve options. And the first thing to look at is the amount of segments that will be created when we revolve this profile. Right now I'm going to set it to 16. Make sure that I'm in polygon mode. The tessellation method is general, and that I'm in quads. Again, making sure the per span number of isoparams is set to 1. And let's go ahead and apply this. And you'll notice what happened was it took our curve and revolved it 16 times around based on the pivot point of the curve that we created. That's very important to remember, that it revolves around the pivot point. And so now I'm just playing around in the channel box, playing with a number of sections, just trying to get it to feel right and still be an efficient in-game model. And since we're dealing in curves here, if I open up the outliner and select the curve, you'll see that we can also modify the look of the object by moving the curve around. So if something's not looking quite right, we can go in and change the verts, we can scale it. See what happens here. If I want to kind of bring this edge out a little bit, I can select those verts and just constrain them and pull them out. Same thing down here. That's why I like modeling with curves, is because I'm never locked into anything. Until I delete the history of the object, I can always go back to the original curve I created and use that to modify the object. And I'll go ahead and show you how that works by deleting the history on this piece and then selecting the curve. And look, as I move the curve, now it's no longer connected to the geometry I made. So when working with curves, delete your history wisely, because if you do it too early, you may want to go back and use your curve to edit a piece and you won't be able to. Another thing you may have noticed is that this object is entirely soft-edged. So right now I'm going up to the Normals tab and hardening all the edges, which is not what I want either. What I want to do is just harden the edges of kind of the profile here to kind of keep the piece looking the way I want. You may want to harden every edge if that's the look you're going for, but for this piece, I'm just going to make the profile edges hard. So go up to Normals and harden those edges. And now you can see it has more of a kind of a sci-fi look to it, which is what I'm going for in this example. And that is basically how revolve works. So the next thing I want to show you is how to extrude using curves. So what I'm going to do is just kind of build a little hose off one of these rounded pieces. And so right now I'm selecting these faces, hitting Shift period to grow the selection. And now I'm toggling off the back faces of the polygons just to kind of take those out of the equation for now. What I'm going to do is create an EP curve based on this hole. So holding down V to snap to a point, I'm drawing a new curve and hitting enter. And let's go ahead and center the pivot point here just to be neat. And what I've done is I've created kind of the profile piece that will loft along a new curve. Okay, so far so good. Let's go ahead and shade this just so we can see a little bit better. Now I'm going to create another EP curve. And what this is going to be is the path that the profile will follow. Maybe this is some kind of hose or pipe or something. All right, very good. Let's go back to our perspective view. And I'm going to go ahead and snap the first control vert to where the pivot point of our original profile would be. And now going back up to the outliner, what I want to do is select the profile curve and then the curve that I want the profile to follow. Go back to surfaces. And then before we extrude this, let's look at some of the options. And so the first thing to check is that the style is a tube. You have a complete curve range, we're outputting as polygons. The tessellation method is general, and we're using quads. And again, make sure your per span number of isoparams is set to 1. And we can change that later if we want, and hit apply. And what we have is a nice extruded shape along a path. And while this is a pretty good start for this extrusion, I still want to go into the channel box and start messing around with some of the other parameters. I changed the format to count just to kind of see what that would give me. Also fit, but I found that, as I showed earlier, general gives you the best look. And like I did with earlier curves, I'm messing around now with the tessellation parameters just to see what it gives me. Because I am having some issues with this piece. I feel like it's not smooth enough. It's a little bit chunky in spots. But at this point I'm not too concerned. I know that we can fix that later. But before we do that, I wanted to show you some of the other things we can do in the channel box. For example, we can scale our extrusion. We can also rotate it, which is more of a twisting than rotation. And we can type in numbers higher than 360 in case you were just using the middle mouse button to scroll through your rotation. Put that back at 0. And now let's go back to our curve, and I want to fix the blockiness and the unevenness that we're seeing in the tessellation here. So to do that, let's go back to our side view. Let's turn off shading so we can see. And find that curve in the outliner. Now, like previous curved pieces we've made, you see we can go into the control vertexes here and kind of manually push them around. So you could kind of fix a piece like this by hand if you wanted to, but there's a more mathematical way to go about doing this. And that is done by rebuilding our curve. If you'll remember the original curve I made, I did it by just kind of clicking around randomly. So the spacing of the verts was very uneven. But if we go into the number of spans here and type in, for example, 16, let's try 48. Now it will rebuild our curve with a more even subdivision. But you can see that it's still pretty blocky. So what I'm going to do is rebuild the curve another time as a 3-cubic curve. And in Maya, this kind of curve is known as a CV curve. And it's a much smoother kind of curve that's based more on control points. And so you can see right now I'm just kind of pushing these points around, not really paying attention to the geometry as much as I'm paying attention to just the smoothness of this curve. So once I get the smoothness right, we will go in and we will rebuild the curve another time. And now we will switch back to the one linear curve, or the EP curve. And I'm going to add 24 spans in here, hit apply, and you'll notice that the curve is much smoother now. The blockiness that we had from my original curve is gone, plus the tessellation is much more even. And another thing, as a side note, it's also laid out a pretty rudimentary set of UVs for us. So those of you that are familiar with UV mapping, you would know that this piece would not be fun to unwrap. So that's another benefit of using curves, is it will lay out a nice set of UVs that's at least a good starting point. What I just did right there was I welded the object together and then softened the normals, because there was a seam down the middle where nothing was attached since the original curve I made wasn't attached. And that just about covers extruding a curve along a path. And so the next thing I would like to go over is how to extrude a curve along two different paths. So to do this, we'll make a real basic curve, just a line. And what I'm doing right here is I'm going to center the pivot point on it and then snap the pivot point to the very end of this curve by holding down C, which is snap to curve, and then snap the curve back to this original profile that we drew earlier. And if we go up to the Surfaces tab and extrude it, it gives you pretty much the result that you'd expect. But what would happen if we tried to take this curve and now extrude it along two curves that were different? So I'm duplicating the original profile, and I'm just going to kind of push and pull some points so that this looks different than the original curve. And what I'm going to use is a tool called the Bi-Rail tool. Now that I have this set up, I'm going to go up to the Surfaces tab, go to Bi-Rail, and use the Bi-Rail 1 tool. And you can see it took the new curve that we drew, and it extruded it along two curves. And if we go in here and push these points, we can, just like with every other curve, we can modify this after the fact. Now, I don't know if you noticed the first time I did this tool, but there's definitely an order of operations to complete the tool. First, you select the curve you want to extrude, and then you select the two curves you want to follow, and then you go up to Surfaces and use the Bi-Rail function. And this is a great tool for organic modeling or for creating shapes that just can't be done with regular extrusion. Alright, so let's keep moving. The next thing I want to do is delete this hose and curve that we made earlier. We're going to make a new hose, but use a different technique. So what I'm doing is I'm looking for that original curve that I made. That was the profile for the hose. And I'm going to duplicate it by hitting Control D. Kind of snap that to a distance. And now let's go to Surfaces, and I'm going to go to the Edit Curves tab and offset the curve. And oh my gosh, what just happened? Well, let me tell you. It took the original curve and duplicated it and offset it by the default, which is 1 unit, whether you're in meters or centimeters. And what I'm going to do is kind of shrink that down a little bit. 1 is just too big. Duplicate this curve again, and now let's offset this curve one more time, and I'm going to offset it, let's see, 0.125. And what I've done is created an order of curves that I can now select. Keep in mind I'm doing this in a specific order so that when we go up to Surfaces and loft this, we've now created a new shape. And I must say that this is one of the techniques that I use the most, where I draw out a curve, offset the curve, and then use the curves to loft a new shape. I find it's very accurate and precise, more so than just offsetting a polygon in some cases. And so right now I've duplicated the shape a couple times just to kind of create this hose, and I'm going to go and weld it together into one piece. And if you notice, I combine the pieces using a mel script up in my shelf, and all that mel script does is combine all the pieces together and then merge any verts that are sitting on top of each other. And so now we have a nice straight hose, but unlike lofting the profile along a curve, this one is just sitting flat in space. And so what we want to do is now bend this after the fact. So what I'm doing is drawing a new EP curve, and I'm holding down V just to snap it to some of the control points. And so my goal here is to create a curve that we can attach to the geometry of the hose that we've made. and then use the curve to bend the hose to a more interesting position, similar to something we would have got if we had extruded a curve along another curve. So right now I'm rebuilding the curve as a cubic curve. If you'll remember, that's the curve that is much more curvy and not linear. So you could see the curve is bending the way I like. I think I've added 5 or 6 kind of control points here. That should be enough to deform the geometry. And if that turns out to not be enough, we can always go and rebuild the curve another time and add more control points. And let's switch from surfaces to animation. Go to the Create Deformer tab and use the Wire tool. Now the way this works is we select our geometry and hit Enter, and then the curve we want, and then hit Enter again. And once these two are linked together, you can see the geometry now is kind of a pinkish color, and we can go to our curve and push and pull our points around, and it will deform the geometry in a way that we never would have gotten with an extrusion. So that's essentially how the Wire tool works. Now sometimes you'll have to go and kind of adjust some things. As you'll see as I kind of pull the points around, the further I deform the object, the more some of the verts unevenly space. So to fix that, we have to kind of adjust our drop-off distance. And as I middle mouse scrub that drop-off distance, I went as high as 20 in this case. It follows the curve a little bit better. And so you kind of have to look at what you're deforming and make sure that it's deforming correctly. If it starts falling off the curve, or if it starts squishing in any way, go in and start messing with the drop-off distance. Alright, now that we've gone over the Wire tool, the next tool I want to show you is actually one of Maya's bonus tools. So if I go ahead and double-click this edge down here, go up to the Bonus Tools tab, there is a tool called Create Curve from Edge. And it does pretty much what it says it's going to do. It's going to take an edge that we've selected and create a curve. I usually uncheck Connect to Mesh and just hit Apply. Now we've created a brand new curve off a set of edges that we already have. So this one's really good for, let's say, continuing on a piece that might have an open face, or just building up something next to something else. I really think this is a good time saver tool, because the alternative is to, hold down V and draw a new curve, snapping it onto an existing piece. And not only can you kind of mess that up, it also just takes a little bit longer. And I do that as well, but if I already have an edge that I just want to turn to a curve, this is the best way to do it. Some of the later chapters on this DVD are going to be a time lapse of me building the environment based on the concept. And one thing I think that you'll take away from that is that I do a lot of modeling with curves. So let's go ahead and take this new lofted piece and just harden that edge, just so it looks correct. And let's group this guy into one group just to be neat. And that's done by going up to Edit, Group. Also, you can go to the Edit tab and ungroup it. And these are also two commands that I have hotkeyed, since you'll be grouping and ungrouping things a lot, just to keep your scene organized and neat. So I'm getting kind of tired of this blue gradient background in Maya. So if I hit Alt-B or Option-B on the Macintosh, what that does is it just cycles through some background presets. So now I just kind of made it a neutral gray. It's a little bit easier to see. Maybe my eyes are going since I stare at a screen 12 hours a day. But I think a solid background color makes it easier to see the curves and the lattices. So I'm going to take this selection of edges and just convert it to vertices real quick. And we'll use this selection to go over the lattice tool. And the lattice tool is found under the animation menu. So let's go ahead and switch to that. Go up here to top left, go to animation. And then under create deformers, there's a lattice. And if you don't know what a lattice does, hopefully it'll make sense kind of watching. But it's really a way to kind of squish and scale your geometry. So what I'm using it for right now is to make sure, kind of the four corners of my cylinder here are on the grid. And the way that you get to these lattice control points is after you make the lattice, you right-click next to it and select Lattice Point. Once you start using lattices, you'll find it's one of those things you can't live without because they snap to the grid, they can be very precise. You don't have to use it on your whole object. For example, right now we're just doing it on the points we had selected. So you can kind of push and deform just sections of your geometry using a lattice. You can also adjust your lattice in the channel box to give it more lattice points to get even more control. So that's a lattice. What I want to go over now is deformers. So selecting this hose piece, we can go to Create Deformer, go to a nonlinear deformer. What I selected here was the bend. And it's not really doing anything at the moment, which for now is a good thing because we just need to kind of get this into position. And there's no correct position for this to be. Once we start bending it, you'll see that you can play with that. So next thing I'm going to do is go to the channel box and go to the curvature option. And if I middle mouse scrub through, you can kind of get an idea what this thing is doing. And at this point, it's doing something I don't want. I don't want it curving away from kind of the base piece here. So if you adjust the low bound and high bound, that's a way you can kind of pin the beginning or the end of the curve, which you might want to do. And so this is some more scrubbing with the middle mouse button, kind of see how far I can take this thing. And not only can we adjust the deformer by moving it around, we can also scale it and rotate it. I tend to think of these nonlinear deformers as kind of free-form tools. I don't think they're very precise. You'd have a hard time getting a perfect bend out of it if you wanted one bend to kind of meet up with another. You're probably better off using the bridge tool. So I'm going to go ahead and use another one on this base piece, and this is the twist tool. So in the channel box, start messing with some of the attributes. And that should make sense. It's twisting the object. We can move this nonlinear deformer up and down, get different results. This kind of goes with the philosophy of build everything in its simplest form and kind of try and twist it and bend it later. A good example would be something like this that I wanted to flare out. I would build it in a way that it was pretty straightforward and then do the flaring with a deformer like this, as opposed to kind of building it flared out from the start. This is a little bit faster and easier. So deformers were the last thing I wanted to go over in this chapter. And I'm not going to be able to go over all of them because there's quite a few, but they all work in basically the same way. So take some time and mess around with them. You can be very creative, get a lot of cool results. You can also animate them, set keys to them. And based on their titles, it should be pretty self-explanatory what each one of them does. And that's about it for this chapter. That's the basics of using curves for modeling. And don't worry, I know that was probably a lot to digest, but once we get to the modeling time-lapse chapters, you'll see how I use these tools and it should all make perfect sense.